The past is never dead. It's not even past. William Faulkner. We agreed to meet a few hours after the funeral. In the Frogmore Gardens, by the old Gothic ruin. I got there first. I looked around, saw no one. I checked my phone. No texts, no voicemails. They must be running late, I thought, leaning against the stone wall. I put away my phone and told myself, stay calm. The weather was quintessentially April. Not quite winter, not yet. Spring. The trees were bare, but the air was soft. The sky was gray, but the tulips were popping. The light was pale, but the indigo lake, threading through the gardens, glowed. How beautiful it all is, I thought. And also how sad. Once upon a time, this was going to be my forever home. Instead it had proved to be just another brief stop. When my wife and I fled this place, in fear for our sanity and physical safety, I wasn't sure when I'd ever come back. That was January 2020. Now, 15 months later, here I was, days after waking to 32 missed calls and then one short, heart-racing talk with Granny, Harry. Grandpa's gone. The wind picked up, turned colder. I hunched my shoulders, rubbed my arms, regretted the thinness of my white shirt. I wished I'd not changed out of my funeral suit. I wished I'd thought to bring a coat. I turned my back to the wind and saw, looming behind me, the Gothic ruin, which in reality was no more Gothic than the Millennium Wheel. Some clever architect, some bit of stagecraft. Like so much around here, I thought. I moved from the stone wall to a small wooden bench. Sitting, I checked my phone again. Peered up and down the garden path. Where are they? Another gust of wind. Funny, it reminded me of Grandpa. His wintry demeanor, maybe. Or his icy sense of humor. I recalled one particular shooting weekend years ago. A mate, just trying to make conversation, asked Grandpa what he thought of my new beard, which had been causing concern in the family and controversy in the press. Should the Queen force Prince Harry to shave? Grandpa looked at my mate, looked at my chin, broke into a devilish grin. That's no beard. Everyone laughed. To beard or not to beard, that was the question, but leave it to Grandpa to demand more beard. Let grow the luxurious bristles of a bloody Viking. I thought of Grandpa's strong opinions, his many passions, carriage, driving, barbecuing, shooting, food, beer. The way he embraced life. He had that in common with my mother. Maybe that was why he'd been such a fan. Long before she was Princess Diana, back when she was simply Dianaspencer, kindergarten teacher, secret girlfriend of Prince Charles, my grandfather was her loudest advocate. Some said he actually brokered my parents' marriage. If so, an argument could be made that Grandpa was the prime cause in my world. But for him, I wouldn't be here. Neither would my older brother. Then again, maybe our mother would be here if she hadn't married. I recalled one recent chat. Just me and Grandpa, not long after he'd turned 97. He was thinking about the end. He was no longer capable of pursuing his passions, he said. And yet the thing he missed most was work. Without work, he said, everything crumbles. He didn't seem sad, just ready. You have to know when it's time to go, Harry. I glanced now into the distance, towards the mini skyline of crypts and monuments alongside Frogmore, the royal burial ground, final resting place for so many of us, including Queen Victoria. Also, the notorious Wallis Simpson. Also, her doubly notorious husband Edward, the former king and my great-great-uncle. After Edward gave up his throne for Wallis, after they fled Britain, both of them fretted about their ultimate return. Both obsessed about being buried right here. The Queen, my grandmother, granted their plea, but she placed them at a distance from everyone else, beneath a stooped plane tree. One last finger wag, perhaps. One final exile, maybe. I wondered how Wallis and Edward felt now about all their fretting. Did any of it matter in the end? I wondered if they wondered at all. Were they floating in some airy realm, still mulling their choices, or were they nowhere, thinking nothing? Could there really be nothing after this? Does consciousness, like time, have a stop? Or maybe, I thought, just maybe, they're here right now, next to the fake Gothic ruin, or next to me, eavesdropping on my thoughts. And if so, maybe my mother is too. The thought of her, as always, gave me a jolt of hope and a burst of energy and a stab of sorrow. I missed my mother every day, but that day, on the verge of that nerve-wracking rendezvous at Frogmore, I found myself longing for her, and I couldn't say just why. Like so much about her, it was hard to put into words. Although my mother was a princess, named after a goddess, both those terms always felt weak, inadequate. People routinely compared her to icons and saints, from Nelson Mandela to Mother Teresa to Joan Arc, but every such comparison, while lofty and loving, also felt wide of the mark. The most recognizable woman on the planet, one of the most Beloved, my mother was simply indescribable. That was the plain truth. And yet how could someone so far beyond everyday language remain? So real, so palpably present, so exquisitely vivid in my mind. How was it possible that I could see her, clear as the swan skimming towards me on that indigo lake? How could I hear her laughter, loud as the songbirds in the bare trees? Still, there was so much I didn't remember because I was so young when she died. But the greater miracle was all that I did. Her devastating smile, her vulnerable eyes, her childlike love of movies and music and clothes and sweets and us. Oh, how she loved my brother and me. Obsessively, she once confessed to an interviewer. Well, mummy vice versa. Maybe she was omnipresent for the very same reason that she was indescribable, because she was light, pure and radiant light. And how can you really describe light? Even Einstein struggled with that one. Recently, astronomers rearranged their biggest telescopes, aimed them at one tiny crevice in the cosmos, and managed to catch a glimpse of one breathtaking sphere, which they named Earendel, the Old English word for morning star. Billions of miles off, and probably long vanished. Earendel is closer to the Big Bang, the moment of creation, than our own Milky Way, and yet it's somehow still visible to mortal eyes because it's just so awesomely bright and dazzling. That was my mother. That was why I could see her, sense her, always, but especially that April afternoon at Frogmore. That, and the fact that I was carrying her flag. I'd come to those gardens because I wanted peace. I wanted it more than anything. I wanted it for my family's sake, and for my own, but also for hers. People forget how much my mother strove for peace. She circled the globe many times over, traipsed through minefields, cuddled aides, patients, consoled war orphans, always working to bring peace to someone somewhere, and I knew how desperately she would did want peace between her boys, and between us two and Pa, and among the whole family. For months the Windsors had been at war. There had been strife in our ranks, off and on, going back centuries, but this was different. This was a full-scale public rupture, and it threatened to become irreparable. So, though I'd flown home specifically and solely for Grandpa's funeral, while there I'd asked for this secret meeting with my older brother, Willie, and my father to talk about the state of things, to find a way out. But now I looked once more at my phone and once more up and down the garden path, and I thought, maybe they've changed their minds. Maybe they're not going to come. For half a second I considered giving up, going for a walk through the gardens by myself, or heading back to the house where all my cousins were drinking and sharing stories of Grandpa. Then, at last, I saw them, shoulder to shoulder, striding towards me. They looked grim, almost menacing. More, they looked tightly aligned. My stomach dropped. Normally they'd be squabbling about one thing or another, but now they appeared to be in lockstep, in league. The thought occurred, hang on, are we meeting for a walk or a duel? I rose from the wooden bench, made a tentative step towards them, gave a weak smile. They didn't smile back. Now my heart really started thrashing in my chest. Deep breaths, I told myself. Apart from fear, I was feeling a kind of hyper-awareness and a hugely intense vulnerability, which I'd experienced at other key moments of my life. Walking behind my mother's coffin, going into battle for the first time, giving a speech in the middle of a panic attack. There was that same sense of embarking on a quest and not knowing if I was up to it, while also fully knowing that there was no turning back. That fate was in the saddle. Okay, Mummy, I thought, picking up the pace, here goes. Wish me luck. We met in the middle of the path. Willie, hello, Harold, painfully tepid. We wheeled, formed a line, set off along the gravel path over the little ivy-covered stone bridge. The way we simply fell into this synchronous alignment, the way we wordlessly assumed the same measured paces and bowed heads, plus the nearness of those graves. How could anyone not be reminded of Mummy's funeral? I told myself not to think about that, to think instead about the pleasing crunch of our footsteps and the way our words flew away like wisps of smoke on the wind. Being British, being Windsors, we began chatting casually about the weather. We compared notes about Grandpa's funeral. He'd planned it all himself, down to the tiniest detail. We reminded each other with rueful smiles, small talk, the smallest. We touched on all secondary subjects, and I kept waiting for us to get to the primary one, wondering why it was taking so long, and also how on earth my father and brother could appear so calm. I looked around. We'd covered a fair bit of terrain, and were now smack in the middle of the royal burial ground, more up to our ankles in bodies than Prince Hamlet. Come to think of it, did and I myself once asked to be buried here. Hours before I'd gone off to war, my private secretary said I needed to choose the spot where my remains should be interred. Should the worst happen, your royal highness, war being uncertain thing. There were several options. St. George's Chapel, the Royal Vault at Windsor, where Grandpa was being settled at this moment. No, I'd chosen this one because the gardens were lovely and because it seemed peaceful. Our feet almost on top of Wally Simpson's face, Pa launched into a micro-lecture about this personage over here, that royal cousin over there, all the once eminent dukes and duchesses, lords and ladies, currently residing beneath the lawn. A lifelong student of history, he had loads of information to share, and part of me thought we might be there for hours, and that there might be a test at the end. Mercifully, he stopped, and we carried on along the grass around the edge of the lake, arriving at a beautiful little patch of daffodils. It was there, at last, that we got down to business. I tried to explain my side of things. I wasn't at my best. For starters, I was still nervous, fighting to keep my emotions in check, while also striving to be succinct and precise. More, I'd vowed not to let this encounter devolve into another argument, but I quickly discovered that it wasn't up to me. Pa and Willie had their parts to play, and they'd come ready for a fight. Every time I ventured a new explanation, started a new line of thought, one or both of them would cut me off. Willie in particular didn't want to hear anything. After he'd shut me down several times, he and I began sniping, saying some of the same things we'd said for months, years. It got so heated that Pa raised his hands. Enough. He stood between us, looking up at our flushed faces. Please, boys, don't make my final years a misery. His voice sounded raspy, fragile. It sounded, if I'm being honest, old. I thought about Grandpa. All at once something shifted inside of me. I looked at Willie, really. Looked at him, maybe for the first time since we were boys. I took it all in, his familiar scowl, which had always been his default in dealings with me, his alarming baldness, more advanced than my own, his famous resemblance to Mummy, which was fading with time, with age. In some ways he was my mirror, in some ways he was my opposite. My beloved brother, my arch nemesis. How had that happened? I felt massively tired. I wanted to go home, and I realized what a complicated concept home had become, or maybe always was. I gestured at the gardens, the city beyond, the nation, and said, Willie, this was supposed to be our home. We were going to live here the rest of our lives. You left, Harold. Yeah, and you know why. I don't. You don't. I honestly don't. I leaned back. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was one thing to disagree about who was at fault or how things might have been different, but for him to claim total ignorance of the reasons I'd fled the land of my birth, the land for which I'd fought and been ready to die, my mother country, that fraught phrase, to claim no knowledge of why my wife and I took the drastic step of picking up our child and just running like hell, leaving behind everything, house, friends, furniture. Really, I looked up at the trees. You don't know, Harold. I honestly don't. I turned to Pa. He was gazing at me with an expression that said, neither do I. Wow, I thought. Maybe they really don't. Staggering. But maybe it was true. And if they didn't know why I'd left, maybe they just didn't know me at all. And maybe they never really did. And to be fair, maybe I didn't either. The thought made me feel colder and terribly alone. But it also fired me up. I thought, I have to tell them. How can I tell them? I can't. It would take too long. Besides, they're clearly not in the right frame of mind to listen. Not now, anyway. Not today. And so, Willie, world, here you go. There are always stories. People would whisper now and then about folks who hadn't fared well at Balmoral. The long-ago queen, for instance. Mad with grief, she'd locked herself inside Balmoral Castle and vowed never to come out. And very proper former prime minister, he'd called the place surreal and utterly freaky. Still, I don't think I heard those stories until much later. Or maybe I heard them and they didn't register. To me, Balmoral was always simply paradise. A cross between Disney World and some sacred druid grove. I was always too busy fishing, shooting, running up and down the hill to notice anything off about the feng shui of the old castle. What I'm trying to say is, I was happy there. In fact, it's possible that I was never happier than that one golden summer day at Balmoral, August 30th, 1997. We'd been at the castle for 1 week. The plan was to stay for another. Same as the previous year, same as the year before that. Balmoral was its own micro-season, a 2-week interlude in the Scottish Highlands to mark the turn from high summer to early autumn. Granny was there too. Naturally, she spent most of every summer at Balmoral, and Grandpa, and Willie, and Pa, the whole family, with the exception of Mummy, because Mummy was no longer part of the family. She'd either bolted or been thrown out, depending on whom you asked, though I never asked anyone. Either way, she was having her own holiday. Elsewhere, Greece, someone said. No, Sardinia, someone said. No, Someone chimed in, "Your mother's in Paris." Maybe it was Mummy herself who said that when she phoned earlier that day for a chat. Alas, the memory lies with a million others on the other side of a high mental wall. Such a horrid, tantalizing feeling to know they're over there, just on the other side, mere inches away. But the wall is always too high, too thick, unscalable, not unlike the turrets of Balmoral. https://m.fcebook.com/group/18228128712976988 https://t me, Afghan Solar Library. 15. Wherever Mummy was, I understood that she was with her new friend. That was the word everyone used. Not boyfriend, not lover. Friend. Nice enough bloke, I thought. Willie and I had just met him. Actually, we'd been with Mummy weeks earlier when she first met him in St. Tropez. We were having a grand time. Just the three of us, staying at some old gent's villa. There was much laughter, horseplay, the norm whenever Mummy and Willie and I were together, though even more so on that holiday. Everything about that trip to St. Tropez was heaven. The weather was sublime, the food was tasty, Mummy was smiling. Best of all, there were jet skis. Whose were they? Don't know, but I vividly remember Willie and me riding them out to the deepest part of the channel, circling while waiting for the big ferries to come. We used their massive wakes as ramps to get airborne. I'm not sure how we weren't killed. Was it after we got back from that jet ski misadventure that Mummy's friend first appeared? No, more likely it was just before. Hello there, you. Must be Harry. Raven hair, leathery tan, bone white smile. How are you today? My name is blah blah. He chatted us up, chatted Mummy up. Specifically Mummy. His eyes plumping into red hearts. He was cheeky, no doubt. But, again, nice enough. He gave Mummy a present diamond bracelet. She seemed to like it. She wore it a lot. Then he faded from my consciousness. As long as Mummy's happy, I told Willie, who said he felt the same. Shock to the system, going from sun-drenched St. Tropez to cloud-shadowed Balmoral. I vaguely remember that shock, though I can't remember much else about our first week at the castle. Still, I can almost guarantee it was spent mostly outdoors. My family lived to be outdoors, especially Granny, who got cross if she didn't breathe at least an hour of fresh air each day. What we did outdoors, however, what we said, wore, ate, I can't conjure. There's some reporting that we journeyed by the royal yacht from the Isle of Wight to the castle, the yacht's final voyage. Sounds lovely. What I do retain, in crisp detail, is the physical setting. The dense woods, the deer-nibbled hill, the River Dee snaking down through the highlands, Lochnagar soaring overhead, eternally snow-spattered. Landscape, geography, architecture, that's how my memory rolls. Dates, sorry, I'll need to look them up. Dialogue, I'll try my best, but make no verbatim claims, especially when it comes to the 90s. But ask me about any space I've occupied: castle, cockpit, classroom, stateroom, bedroom, palace, garden, pub, and I'll recreate it down to the carpet tacks. Why should my memory organize experience like this? Is it genetics, trauma, some Frankenstein-esque combination of the two? Is it my inner soldier assessing every space as potential battlefield? Is it my innate homebody nature rebelling against a forced nomadic existence? Is it some base apprehension that the world is essentially a maze, and you should never be caught in a maze without a map? Whatever the cause, my memory is my memory. It does what it does, gathers and curates as it sees fit, and there's just as much truth in what I remember and how I remember it as there is in so-called objective facts. Things like chronology and cause and effect are often just fables we tell ourselves about the past. The past is never dead. It's not even past. When I discovered that quotation not long ago on brainyquote.com, I was thunderstruck. I thought, who the fuck is Faulkner? And how's he related to us Windsors? And so, Balmoral. Closing my eyes, I can see the main entrance, the paneled front windows, the wide portico and 3 gray-black speckled granite steps leading up to the massive front door of whiskey-colored oak, often propped open by a heavy curling stone and often manned by one red-coated footman, and inside the spacious hall and its white stone floor, with gray star-shaped tiles, and the huge fireplace with its beautiful mantel, ornately carved dark wood, and to one side a kind of utility room, and to the left, by the tall windows, hooks for fishing rods and walking sticks, rubber waders and heavy waterproofs, so many waterproofs, because summer could be wet and cold all over Scotland. But it was biting in this Siberian nook, and then the light brown wooden door leading to the corridor with the crimson carpet, and the walls papered in cream, a pattern of gold flock raised like braille, and then the many rooms along the corridor, each with a specific purpose, like sitting or reading, TV or tea, and one special room for the pages, many of whom I loved like dotty uncles, and finally the castle's main chamber, built in the 19th century, nearly on top of the site of another castle dating to the 14th century, within a few generations of another Prince Harry, who got himself exiled, then came back, and annihilated everything and everyone in sight. My distant kin, my kindred spirit, some would claim. If nothing else, my namesake. Born September 15, 1984, I was christened Henry Charles Albert David of Wales. But from day one everyone called me Harry. In the heart of this main chamber was the grand staircase. Sweeping, dramatic, seldom used. Whenever Granny headed up to her bedroom on the second floor, Corgis at her heels, she preferred the lift. The Corgis preferred it too. Near Granny's lift, through a pair of crimson saloon doors and along a green tartan floor, was a smallish staircase with a heavy iron banister. It led up to the second floor, where stood a statue of Queen Victoria. I always bowed to her as I passed. Your Majesty. Willie did too. We'd been told to, but I'd have done it anyway. I found the grandmama of Europe hugely compelling, and not just because Granny loved her, nor because Pa once wanted to name me after her husband. Victoria knew great love, soaring happiness, but her life was essentially tragic. Her father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, was said to be a sadist, sexually aroused by the sight of soldiers being horsewhipped, and her dear husband, Albert, died before her eyes. Also, during her long, lonely reign, she was shot at 8 times, on 8 separate occasions, by 7 different subjects. Not one bullet hit the mark. Nothing could bring Victoria down. Beyond Victoria's statue, things got tricky. Doors became identical, rooms interlocked, easy to get lost. Open the wrong door and you might burst in on Pa while his valet was helping him dress. Worse, you might blunder in as he was doing his headstands. Prescribed by his physio, these exercises were the only effective remedy for the constant pain in Pa's neck and back. Old polo injuries, mostly. He performed them daily, in just a pair of boxers, propped against a door or hanging from a bar like a skilled acrobat. If you set one little finger on the knob, you'd hear him begging from the other side. No, no, don't open. Please God, don't open. Balmoral had 50 bedrooms, one of which had been divided for me and Willie. Adults called it the nursery. Willie had the larger half, with a double bed, a good-sized basin, a cupboard with mirrored doors, a beautiful window looking down on the courtyard, the fountain, the bronze statue of a roe deer. Buck. My half of the room was far smaller, less luxurious. I never asked why. I didn't care. But I also didn't need to ask. 2 years older than me, Willie was the heir, whereas I was the spare. This wasn't merely how the press referred to us, though it was definitely that. This was shorthand often used by Pa and Mummy and Grandpa, and even Granny. The heir and the spare. There was no judgment about it, but also no ambiguity. I was the shadow, the support, the plan B. I was brought into the world in case something happened to Willie. I was summoned to provide backup, distraction, diversion, and, if necessary, a spare part. Kidney, perhaps, blood transfusion, speck of bone marrow. This was all made explicitly clear to me from the start of life's journey, and regularly reinforced. Thereafter, I was 20 the first time I heard the story of what Pa allegedly said to Mummy the day of my birth. Wonderful. Now you've given me an heir and a spare. My work is done. A joke, presumably. On the other hand, minutes after delivering this bit of high comedy, Pa was said to have gone off to meet with his girlfriend. So, many a true word spoken in jest. I took no offense. I felt nothing about it, any of it. Succession was like the weather or the positions of the planets or the turn of the seasons. Who had the time to worry about things so unchangeable? Who could bother with being bothered by a fate etched in stone? Being a Windsor meant working out which truths were timeless and then banishing them from your mind. It meant absorbing the basic parameters of one's identity, knowing by instinct who you were, which was forever a byproduct of who you weren't. I wasn't Granny. I wasn't Pa. I wasn't Willie. I was third in line behind them. Every boy and girl, at least once, imagines themselves as a prince or princess. Therefore, spare or no spare, it wasn't half bad to actually be one. More, standing resolutely behind the people you loved, wasn't that definition of honor, of love, like bowing to Victoria as you passed. Next to my bedroom was a sort of round sitting room. Round table, wall, mirror, writing desk, fireplace with cushioned hearths around. In the far corner stood a great big wooden door that led to a bathroom. The 2 marble basins looked like prototypes for the first basins ever manufactured. Everything at Balmoral was either old or made to look so. The castle was a playground, a hunting lodge, but also a stage. The bathroom was dominated by a claw-footed tub, and even the water spurting from its taps seemed old. Not in a bad way. Old like the lake where Merlin helped Arthur find his magic sword. Brownish, suggestive of weak tea. The water often alarmed weekend guests. Sorry, but there seems to be something wrong with the water in my loo. Pa would always smile and assure them that nothing was wrong with the water. On the contrary, it was filtered and sweetened by the Scottish peat. That water came straight off the hill, and what you're about to experience is one of life's finest pleasures. A Highland bath. Depending on your preference, your Highland bath could be Arctic cold or kettle hot. Taps throughout the castle were fine-tuned. For me, few pleasures compared with a scalding soak, but especially while gazing out of the castle's slit windows, where archers, I imagined, once stood guard. I'd look up at the starry sky, or down at the walled gardens, picture myself floating over the great lawn, smooth and green as a snooker table, thanks to a battalion of gardeners. The lawn was so perfect, every blade of grass so precisely mown. Willie and I felt guilty about walking across it, let alone riding our bikes, but we did it anyway, all the time. Once, we chased our cousin across the lawn. We were on quads, the cousin was on a go-kart. It was all fun and games until she crashed head-on into a green lamppost. Crazy fluke, the only lamppost within 1,000 miles. We shrieked with laughter, though the lamppost, which had recently been a tree in one of the nearby forests, snapped cleanly in two and fell on top of her. She was lucky not to be seriously hurt. On August 30th, 1997, I didn't spend a lot of time looking at the lawn. Both Willie and I hurried through our evening baths, jumped into our pajamas, settled eagerly in front of the TV. Footmen arrived, carrying trays covered with plates, each topped with a silver dome. The footmen set the trays upon wooden stands, then joked with us, as they always did, before wishing us bon appetit. Footmen, bone china, it sounds posh, and I suppose it was, but under those fancy domes was just kiddie stuff. Fish fingers, cottage pies, roast chicken, green peas. Mabel, our nanny, who'd once been Pa's nanny, joined us. As we all stuffed our faces, we heard Pa padding past in his slippers, coming from his bath. He was carrying his wireless, which is what he called his portable CD player, on which he liked to listen to his storybooks while soaking. Pa was like clockwork, so when we heard him in the hall, we knew it was close to 8. Half an hour later, we picked up the first sounds of the adults beginning their evening migration downstairs, then the first bleedy notes of the accompanying bagpipes. For the next 2 hours, the adults would be held captive in the dinner dungeon, forced to sit around that long table, forced to squint at each other in the dim gloom of a candelabra designed by Prince Albert, forced to remain ramrod straight before china plates and crystal goblets placed with mathematical precision by staff, forced to peck at quail's eggs and turbot, forced to make idle chit-chat while stuffed into their fanciest kit. Black tie, hard black shoes, trews, maybe even kilts. I thought, what hell, being an adult. Pa stopped by on his way to dinner. He was running late, but he made a show of lifting a silver dome. Yum, wish I was having that. And taking a long sniff. He was always sniffing things. Food, roses, our hair. He must have been a bloodhound in another life. Maybe he took all those long sniffs because it was hard to smell anything over his personal scent. Oh, sauvage. He'd slather the stuff on his cheeks, his neck, his shirt, floury, with a hint of something harsh, like pepper or gunpowder. It was made in Paris. Said so on the bottle, which made me think of Mummy. Yes, Harry, mummies in Paris. Their divorce had become final exactly 1 year before. Almost to the day. Be good, boys. We will, Pa. Don't stay up too late. He left. His scent remained. Willie and I finished dinner, watched some more TV, then got up to our typical pre-bedtime hijinks. We perched on the top step of a side staircase and eavesdropped on the adults, hoping to hear a naughty word or story. We ran up and down the long corridors, under the watchful eyes of dozens of dead stag heads. At some point, we bumped into Granny's Piper. Rumpled, pear-shaped, with wild eyebrows and a tweed kilt, he went wherever Granny went because she loved the sound of pipes, as had Victoria, though Albert supposedly called them a beastly instrument. While summering at Balmoral, Granny asked that the piper play her awake and play her to dinner. His instrument looked like a drunken octopus, except that its floppy arms were etched silver in dark mahogany. We'd seen the thing before, many times, but that night he offered to let us hold it. Try it. Really. Go on. We couldn't get anything out of the pipes but a few piddly squeaks. We just didn't have the puff. The piper, however, had a chest the size of a whiskey barrel. He made it moan and scream. We thanked him for the lesson and bade him good night, then took ourselves back to the nursery, where Mabel monitored the brushing of teeth. and the washing of faces. Then, to bed. My bed was tall. I had to jump to get in, after which I rolled down into its sunken center. It felt like climbing onto a bookcase, then tumbling into a slit trench. The bedding was clean, crisp, various shades of white, alabaster, sheets, cream blankets, eggshell quilts. Everything was pulled tight as a snare drum, so expertly smooth that you could easily spot the centuries' worth of patched holes and tears. I pulled the sheets and covers to my chin, because I didn't like the dark. No, not true, I loathed the dark. Mummy did too, she told me so. I'd inherited this from her, I thought, along with her nose, her blue eyes, her love of people, her hatred of smugness and fakery and all things posh. I can see myself under those covers, staring into the dark, listening to the clicky insects and hooty owls. Did I imagine shapes sliding along the walls? Did I stare at the bar of light along the floor, which was always there, because I always insisted on the door being left open a crack? How much time elapsed before I dropped off? In other words, how much of my childhood remained? And how much did I cherish it, savor it, before groggily becoming aware of? He was standing at the edge of the bed, looking down. His white dressing gown made him seem like a ghost in a play. Yes, darling boy. He gave a half smile, averted his gaze. The room wasn't dark anymore. Wasn't light either. Strange in between. Shade, almost brownish, almost like the water in the ancient tub. He looked at me in a funny way, a way he'd never looked at me before. With fear. What is it, Pa? He sat down on the edge of the bed. He put a hand on my knee. Darling boy, Mummy's been in a car crash. I remember thinking, crash. Okay, but she's all right. Yes, I vividly remember that thought flashing through my mind. And I remember waiting patiently for Pa to confirm that indeed Mummy was all right. And I remember him not doing that. There was then a shift internally. I began silently pleading with Pa, or God, or both. No. Pa looked down into the folds of the old quilts and blankets and sheets. There were complications. Mummy was quite badly injured and taken to hospital, darling boy. He always called me darling boy, but he was saying it quite a lot now. His voice was soft. He was in shock, it seemed. Oh, hospital, yes, with a head injury. Did he mention paparazzi? Did he say she'd been chased? I don't think so. I can't swear to it. But probably not. The paps were such a problem for Mummy, for everyone. It didn't need to be said. I thought again, injured ... but she's okay. She's been taken to hospital. They'll fix her head and we'll go and see her. Today, tonight at the latest. They tried, darling boy. I'm afraid she didn't make it. These phrases remain in my mind like darts in a board. He did say it that way, I know that much for sure. She didn't make it. And then everything seemed to come to a stop. That's not right. Not seemed. Nothing at all seemed. Everything distinctly, certainly, irrevocably, came to a stop. None of what I said to him then remains in my memory. It's possible that I didn't say anything. What I do remember with startling clarity is that I didn't cry. Not one tear. Pa didn't hug me. He wasn't great at showing emotions under normal circumstances. How could he be expected to show them in such a crisis? But his hand did fall once more on my knee and he said, "It's going to be okay." That was quite a lot for him. Fatherly, hopeful, kind, and so very untrue. He stood and left. I don't recall how I knew that he'd already been in the other room, that he'd already told Willie, but I knew. I lay there, or sat there. I didn't get up. I didn't bathe, didn't pee, didn't get dressed, didn't call out to Willie or Mabel. After decades of working to reconstruct that morning, I've come to one inescapable conclusion. I must have remained in that room, saying nothing, seeing no one, until 9 a.m. sharp, when the piper began to play outside. I wish I could remember what he played, but maybe it doesn't matter. With bagpipes, it's not the tune, it's the tone. Thousands of years old. Bagpipes are built to amplify what's already in the heart. If you're feeling silly, bagpipes make you sillier. If you're angry, bagpipes bring your blood to a higher boil. And if you're in grief, even if you're 12 years old and don't know you're in grief, maybe especially if you don't know, bagpipes can drive you mad. It was Sunday. So, as always, we went to church. Crathy Kirk. Walls of granite, large roof of Scottish pine, stained glass. Windows donated decades earlier by Victoria, perhaps to atone for the upset she caused in worshipping there. Something about the head of the Church of England worshipping in the Church of Scotland. It caused a stir, which I never understood. I've seen photographs of us going into the church that day, but they bring back no memories. Did the minister say anything? Did he make it worse? Did I listen to him or stare at the back of the pew and think about Mummy? On the way back to Balmoral, a 2-minute drive, it was suggested that we stop. People had been gathering all morning outside the front gates. Some had begun leaving things. Stuffed animals, flowers, cards. Acknowledgement should be made. We pulled over, stepped out. I could see nothing but a matrix of colored dots, flowers, and more flowers. I could hear nothing but a rhythmic clicking from across the road. The press. I reached for my father's hand for comfort, then cursed myself because that gesture set off an explosion of clicks. I'd given them exactly what they wanted. Emotion, drama, pain. They fired and fired and fired. Hours later, Pa left for Paris, accompanied by Mummy's sisters, Aunt Sarah and Aunt Jane. They needed to learn more about the crash, someone said, and they needed to arrange for the return of Mummy's body. Body. People kept using that word. It was a punch in the throat and a bloody lie because Mummy wasn't dead. That was my sudden insight. With nothing to do but roam the castle and talk to myself, a suspicion took hold, which then became a firm belief. This was all a trick, and for once the trick wasn't being played by the people around me or the press, but by Mummy. Her life's been miserable. She's been hounded, harassed, lied about, lied to. So she's staged an accident as a diversion and run away. The realization took my breath away, made me gasp with relief. Of course, it's all a ruse so she can make a clean start. At this very moment, she's undoubtedly renting an apartment in Paris or arranging fresh flowers in her secretly purchased log cabin somewhere way up high in Swiss Alps. Soon, she'll send for me and Willie. It's all so obvious. Why didn't I see it before? Mummy isn't dead. She's hiding. I felt so much better. Then doubt crept in. Hang on. Mummy would never do this to us. This unspeakable pain. She'd never allow that, let alone cause it. Then back to relief. She had no choice. It was her only hope of freedom. Then doubt again. Mummy wouldn't hide. She's too much of a fighter. Then relief. This is her way of fighting. She'll be back. She has to be. It's my birthday in 2 weeks. But Pa and my aunts came back first. Their return was reported by every TV channel. The world watched as they stepped onto the tarmac at RAF Northolt. One channel even added music to the arrival, someone mournfully singing a psalm. Willie and I were kept from the TV, but I think we heard that. The next few days passed in a vacuum, no one saying anything. We all remained ensconced inside the castle. It was like being inside a crypt, except a crypt where everyone's wearing trues and keeping to normal routines and schedules. If anyone talked about anything, I didn't hear them. The only voice I heard was the one droning in my head, arguing with itself. She's gone. No, she's hiding. She's dead. No, she's playing dead. Then, one morning, it was time. Back to London. I remember nothing about the trip. Did we drive? Did we fly on the royal flight? I can see the reunion with Pa and the aunts and the pivotal encounter with Aunt Sarah, though it's wreathed in fog and might be slightly out of sequence. At times, my memory places it right there, in those horrid first days of September. But, at other times memory casts it forward, to many years later. Whenever it happened like this. William, Harry, Aunt Sarah has something for you, boys. She stepped forward, holding 2 tiny blue boxes. What's this? Open it. I lifted off the top of my blue box. Inside was a moth. No, a mustache. No, what's her hair, Harry? Aunt Sarah explained that, while in Paris, she'd clipped 2 locks from Mummy's head. So there it was. Proof. She's really gone. But then immediately came the reassuring doubt, the life-saving uncertainty. No, this could be anybody's hair. Mummy, her beautiful blonde hair intact, was out there somewhere. I'd know if she weren't. My body would know. My heart would know. And neither knows any such thing. Both were just as full of love for her as ever. Willie and I walked up and down the crowds outside Kensington Palace, smiling, shaking hands, as if we were running for office. Hundreds and hundreds of hands were thrust continually into our faces, the fingers often wet. From what? I wondered. Tears, I realized. I disliked how those hands felt. More, I hated how they made me feel. Guilty. Why were all these people crying when I wasn't, and hadn't? I wanted to cry, and I'd tried to, because Mummy's life had been so sad, that she'd felt the need to disappear, to invent this massive charade. But I couldn't squeeze out one drop. Maybe I'd learned too well, absorbed too deeply the ethos of the family, that crying wasn't an option, ever. I remember the mounds of flowers all around us. I remember feeling unspeakable sorrow and yet being unfailingly polite. I remember old ladies saying, "Oh my, how polite, the poor boy." I remember muttering thanks over and over. Thank you for coming. Thank you for saying that. Thank you for camping out here for several days. I remember consoling several folks who were prostrate, overcome, as if they knew Mummy, but also thinking, you didn't, though. You act as if you did ... but you didn't know her. That is ... you don't know her. present tense. After offering ourselves up to the crowds, we went inside Kensington Palace. We entered through 2 big black doors into Mummy's apartment, went down a long corridor and into a room off the left. There stood a large coffin, dark brown, English oak. Am I remembering or imagining that it was draped in a Union Jack? That flag mesmerized me. Maybe because of my boyish war games. Maybe because of my precocious patriotism. Or maybe because I'd been hearing rumblings for days about the flag, the flag, the flag. That was all anyone could talk about. People were up in arms because the flag hadn't been lowered to half-mast over Buckingham Palace. They didn't care that the royal standard never flew at half-mast, no matter what, that it flew when Granny was in residence and didn't fly when she was away, full stop. They cared only about seeing some official show of mourning, and they were enraged by its absence. That is, they were whipped into rage by the British papers, which were trying to deflect attention from their role in Mummy's disappearance. I recall one headline, addressed pointedly at Granny, show us you care. How rich, coming from the same fiends who cared so much about Mummy that they chased her into a tunnel from which she never emerged. By now I'd overheard this official version of events. Paps chased Mummy through the streets of Paris, then into a tunnel where her Mercedes crashed into a wall or cement pillar, killing her, her friend, and the driver. Standing before the flag-draped coffin, I asked myself, is Mummy a patriot? What does Mummy really think of Britain? Has anyone bothered to ask her? When will I be able to ask her myself? I can't recollect anything the family said in that moment, to each other or to the coffin. I don't recall a word that passed between me and Willie, though. I do remember people around us saying the boys look shell-shocked. Nobody bothered to whisper, as if we were so shell-shocked that we'd gone deaf. There was some discussion about the next day's funeral. Per the latest plan, the coffin would be pulled through the streets on a horse-drawn carriage by the King's troop while Willie and I followed on foot. It seemed a lot to ask of 2 young boys. Several adults were aghast. Mummy's brother, Uncle Charles, raised hell. You can't make these boys walk behind their mother's coffin. It's barbaric. An alternative plan was put forward. Willie would walk alone. He was 15, after all. Leave the younger one out of it. Spare the spare. This alternative plan was sent up the chain. Back came the answer. It must be both princes. To garner sympathy, presumably. Uncle Charles was furious. But I wasn't. I didn't want Willie to undergo an ordeal like that without me. Had the roles been reversed, he'd never have wanted me, indeed, allowed me to go it alone. So, come morning, bright and early, off we went, all together. Uncle Charles on my right, Willie to his right, followed by Grandpa, and on my left was Pa. I noted at the start how serene Grandpa looked, as if this was merely another royal engagement. I could see his eyes, clearly, because he was gazing straight ahead. They all were, but I kept mine down on the road. So did Willie. I remember feeling numb. I remember clenching my fists. I remember keeping a fraction of Willie always in the corner of my vision and drawing loads of strength from that. Most of all, I remember the sounds, the clinking bridles and clopping hooves of the 6 sweaty brown horses, the squeaking wheels of the gun carriage they were hauling. A relic from the First World War, someone said, which seemed right, since Mummy, much as she loved peace, often seemed a soldier, whether she was warring against the Paps or Pia. I believe I'll remember those few sounds for the rest of my life, because they were such a sharp contrast to the otherwise all-encompassing silence. There wasn't one engine, one lorry, one bird. There wasn't one human voice, which was impossible, because 2 million people lined the roads. The only hint that we were marching through a canyon of humanity was the occasional wail. After 20 minutes we reached Westminster Abbey. We filed into a long pew. The funeral began with a series of readings and eulogies, and culminated with Elton John. He rose slowly, stiffly, as if he was one of the great kings buried for centuries beneath the abbey, suddenly roused back to life. He walked to the front, seated himself at a grand piano. Is there anyone who doesn't know that he sang Candle in the Wind, a version he'd reworked for Mummy? I can't be sure the notes in my head are from that moment or from clips I've seen since. Possibly they're vestiges of recurring nightmares. But I do have one pure, indisputable memory of the song climaxing and my eyes starting to sting and tears nearly falling. Nearly. Towards the end of the service came Uncle Charles, who used his allotted time to blast everyone, family, nation, press, for stalking Mummy to her death. You could feel the abbey, the nation outside, recoil from the blow. Truth hurts. Then 8 Welsh guards moved forward, hoisted the enormous lead-line coffin, which was now draped in the royal standard, an extraordinary break with protocol. They'd also yielded to pressure and lowered the flag to half-mast, not the royal standard, of course, but the Union Jack, still an unprecedented compromise. The royal standard was always reserved for members of the royal family, which, I'd been told, Mummy wasn't anymore. Did this mean she was forgiven by Granny? Apparently. But these were questions I couldn't quite formulate, let alone ask an adult, as the coffin was slowly carried outside and loaded into the back of a black hearse. After a long wait, the hearse drove off, rolled steadily through London, which surged on all sides with the largest crowd that ageless city had ever seen, twice as large as the crowds that celebrated the end of the Second World War. It went past Buckingham Palace, up Park Lane, towards the outskirts, over to the Finchley Road, then Hendon Way, then the Brent Cross flyover, then the North Circular, then the M12. Junction 15A and northwards to Harlestone, before passing through the iron front gate of Uncle Charles's estate, Althorpe. Willie and I watched most of that car ride on TV. We were already at Althorpe. We'd been speeded ahead, though it turned out there was no need to hurry. Not only did the hearse go the long way round, it was delayed several times by all the people heaping flowers onto it, blocking the vents, causing the engine to overheat. The driver had to keep pulling over so the bodyguard could get out and clear the flowers off the windscreen. The bodyguard was Graham. Willie and I liked him a lot. We always called him Crackers, as in Graham Crackers. We thought that was hysterical. When the hearse finally got to Althorpe, the coffin was removed again, carried across the pond, over a green iron bridge hastily positioned by military engineers, to a little island, and there it was placed upon a platform. Willie and I walked across the same bridge to the island. It was reported that Mummy's hands were folded across her chest, and between them was placed a photo of me and Willie, possibly the only two men who ever truly loved her, certainly the two who loved her most. For all eternity we'd be smiling at her in the darkness, and maybe it was this image, as the flag came off and the coffin descended to the bottom of the hole, that finally broke me. My body convulsed and my chin fell, and I began to sob uncontrollably into my hands. I felt ashamed of violating the family ethos, but I couldn't hold it in any longer. It's okay, I reassured myself, it's okay. There aren't any cameras around. Besides, I wasn't crying because I believed my mother was in that hole, or in that coffin. I promised myself I'd never believe that, no matter what anyone said. No, I was crying at the mere idea. It would just be so unbearably tragic, I thought, if it was actually true. Then everyone moved on. The family went back to work, and I went back to school, same as I did after every summer holiday. Back to normal, everyone said cheerily. From the passenger seat of Pa's open-topped Aston Martin, everything certainly looked the same. Ludgrove School, nestled in the emerald Berkshire countryside, looked as ever like a country church. Come to think of it, the school motto was from Ecclesiastes, "Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might." Then again, not many country churches could boast 200 acres of woodland and meadows, sports fields and tennis courts, science labs and chapels, plus a well-stocked library. If you wanted to find me in September 1997, the library would have been the last place to look. Better to check the woods or the sports fields. I was always trying to keep moving, keep busy. I was also, most often, alone. I liked people. I was gregarious by nature. But just then I didn't want anyone too close. I needed space. That was a tall order, however, at Ludgrove, where more than 100 boys lived in proximity. We ate together, bathed together, slept together, sometimes 10 to a room. Everyone knew everyone's business, down to who was circumcised and who wasn't. And yet I don't believe one boy so much as mentioned my mother when that new term began. Out of respect, more likely fear,